Hello and welcome in to another episode of the Fantasy Football Forecast. I'm your host, Trevor Scott, joined by my co-host, Matt Duraldi.
What's going on, guys?
And we are back with Week 17, Beat the Waiver Wire. So going into your championship games, right? We're looking ahead. We're trying to plan as part of the Week 16 prep, also looking ahead to Week 17, make sure that your bench is prepared, that your defenses are prepared. So we've kind of been doing this throughout, and so we're back with you looking at the championship week. So I will say right off the top that one of the top defenses that we're going to recommend adding is the Chargers. And obviously, they're going to have played on Thursday night. We're recording this right before the game on Thursday. And so, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to add them if you're watching this later, if you haven't already. They get New England, and Drake May has not been playing nearly as well in the last few games, right? He's got 12 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. I think the Chargers can get after him a little bit. The Chargers defense in terms of sacks has been down over the last month, but I will say that they've gotten Baltimore, Atlanta, Kansas City, and Tampa Bay. That's a decently difficult stretch of offenses to have to deal with. They get Denver on Thursday night, so check in on how they do. If they're still available in your leagues, they likely are because they're only 37% rostered. Next week, hopefully you have some waiver money saved so you can blow it out on the Chargers if the defense is the only thing that you end up needing going into that week. So the guys that should be available, or the teams that should be available, I should say, kicking off with the Philadelphia Eagles. So they're 78% rostered. So the chances that they're available in your league are pretty low. But if they are, get them on your bench. They should absolutely be 100% rostered. They get Dallas in week 17. I know Cooper Rush has been playing better, but Dallas has had an all-time easy stretch of opponents over the last couple of weeks. I don't think that they're just going to be able to move the ball against Philly. I think that that's going to be a very difficult matchup. I could see CeeDee Lamb getting like 10, 12 targets in that game for, one of those 5 yards per catch type of game, where he gets like 10 for 60 or something like that. But overall, Eagles' run defense is really good. I expect them to keep Dowdle in control. I expect them to keep CeeDee Lamb in front of them. And so the Eagles, I think, are an exceptional play in week 17.
Yeah, and Cooper Rush's first start of the year was against the Eagles, and he threw for 45 yards, and the Eagles defense put up 21 fantasy points against them. So I really like them in that matchup. And even you mentioned like an easier stretch of games, like against Cincinnati, who has a terrible defense. Like he was sacked 3 times. He threw an interception. He only threw it 183 yards. So like I love that matchup. And like you said, 78% available. Like probably not going to be, but just double check.
Yeah, and I fully expect them across the board to be ranked as the number 1 defense. So if you have the opportunity to get them now, go and do it. The next team that we're going to look at is another team that I have been a fan of over the last couple of weeks. Somebody that I thought was going to be ranked a lot higher even this week in week 16 going up against Tennessee, but I've seen them kind of down in a lot of rankings, and that's the Indianapolis Colts. So they're 30% rostered. So again, this is a team that you should be able to add onto your bench if you haven't already. If you've been listening to us over the last couple of weeks, we've been touting the Colts for these 2 games specifically. They just put up 11 points against Denver coming out of their bye in week 14. They did give up 25 points, but they only gave up 193 yards, and they intercepted Bo Nix 3 times. So it just looked like they were playing much better. So again, I don't know if it was reinvigorated. I don't know if it's after the bye. I know they only ended up giving up 25 points because, Richardson or the Broncos defense did score a touchdown against them, on that weird A.D. Mitchell play that like they tried to like throw it back and then throw it back over to Richardson, and it didn't work. And it was like a fumble recovery for a touchdown, technically. But overall held them down in terms of yardage, and we're really good at, intercepting Knicks. So I do think we're going to get a good look this week with Tennessee to see if they can be a starter going up against the Giants. So I am planning on playing them in a league. So in our main league, right? I mean, I do think they're going to be my starter this week. So I really hope to see a good matchup or a good showing. I am a little disappointed it's not going to be Will Levis and that it's going to be Mason Rudolph because, I hate to say that I'm more scared of Mason Rudolph. It's not exactly like he's awesome or anything, but
it's fair.
I do think that the turnover worthy plays will go down with him, but hopefully the Colts are able to generate those against him anyways.
Yeah, and I think as far as the matchup in week 17, like I'm more optimistic that they're playing Drew Lock. I thought Tim Boyle actually was throwing the ball pretty well. Like Lock hasn't thrown a touchdown in his 2 starts. He just looks awful. And again, this game is in New Jersey too, so we can't predict the weather that far in advance, but there's a better chance than not that it's going to be kind of crappy.
Yeah, for sure. The third team that we want to go over here are the Commanders. So they're 51% rostered, about half the league. So maybe they're not available in your league, but they get Atlanta in week 17. We're going to get a good look at Michael Penix this week. So add them to your team now, because if he looks bad or the offense overall with Atlanta continues to look like the gears are coming to a halt, I do think that the Commanders could put up a decent total against Atlanta. They're going to have to deal with Bijan Robinson. Obviously, Drake London's a good weapon, but Pitts has been pretty irrelevant for the better part of the last month, and I do think that overall that the Commanders should be able to hold down Atlanta's offense if Penix doesn't look good this week. Now, obviously, if he goes out in his first start and lights it up, you're not going to feel super confident playing the Commanders against them. But, right, this is beat the waiver wire, so you have to add them now so that you are ahead of the game in the event that Penix does not look good. So, obviously going into week 17 prep, they're on your bench already. If he looks good, you just cut him for one of these other teams that we're discussing here.
Yeah, this is a defense that kind of snuck up on me a little bit. Like, we hadn't talked about the Commanders in any of these segments, and obviously when we first did it, like, Kirk Cousins was like not playing well, but like we still thought he was going to get his groove back. But the Commanders too, like we've talked about them throughout the season, how well they played keep away, and against a bad Falcons defense, like they're going to have no trouble controlling the time of possession in this game. So I, for one, am excited to watch Michael Penix play. Like I'm very, very curious because I was high on him. I maybe not as high as the Atlanta Falcons were, but it should be interesting. So yeah, this is a kind of a sneaky play here.
Yeah. So, and then going to the next team that we're talking about here, the Miami Dolphins. So they get Cleveland, and if Dorian Thompson-Robinson is still the starter going into week 17, this might be the defense to get. This might be the one that's the biggest changer in terms of projection from what you would go and see right now. They're 33% rostered. They get San Francisco this week, so you're not playing them this week. But they did just score 11 against Houston. And if they get DTR, who I fully expect to be awful in his start, right? I mean, I think I was telling you, I actually think that he might be the worst rostered quarterback in the league. And that's coming from a Charger fan who had to watch Easton Stick last year. So, I just am fully out on Dorian Thompson-Robinson. I was telling you too, I think maybe they're giving him these 3 starts to evaluate whether or not they even want to keep him on the roster next year. They've said that they want to keep Winston on the roster. They've said they told us previously that Winston was going to be the starter for the remainder of the season, but after another 3 interception game, that obviously changed. So I don't know. I can't stand Dorian Thompson-Robinson in terms of fantasy, and obviously he's, in my opinion, ruining the fantasy values of Judy, Njoku. No value left in Elijah Moore, somebody that we recommended as beat the waiver wire last week. And it's just really frustrating. I'm really bummed because all these Cleveland players were being elevated by Jameis's play, and now I expect them to all kind of bottom out. So I have a league where I lost Kamara and I lost David Montgomery, and I had to pick up Jerome Ford. My only other running back was Jalen Warren on my team. So I'm going to be rolling out Ford and hoping that he can pop one this week. But, in terms of looking forward, the Dolphins, I think, are in a unique position where they finally feel like they're getting a little bit healthier. They just held down Houston's offense, albeit their offense was awful too. So Houston was just trying to run it a little bit more. But against Dorian Thompson-Robinson, I think that's a very good potential add, and then see how Dorian Thompson-Robinson does in his matchup this week.
Yeah, and they sacked CJ Stroud 4 times in that game. And I guess I hadn't really thought through the logic of starting DTR, but I guess that makes sense what you're saying about just they're going to cut him if he's just completely atrocious. There's no need to waste that roster space. But yeah, I mean, Judy going up against Cincinnati this week, if it was Winston, would have been, to me, a top 5 play.
Top 5, yeah, or top 8
like
at
top
worst,
2.
maybe. Yeah, I mean, it's just like, yeah, just like, are we on 200 watch again with him?
Yeah,
Judy and Winston going up against possibly the worst secondary in the league. I don't know. Now, though, I mean, the Bengals, again, another team that wasn't on the fantasy radar at all. And then they make the switch and they jump in projection immediately following that, so I don't know. I think looking on Sleeper, the Dolphins are projected for 8 points, but I think once they update their projections after we get to week 17. I expect that to jump to 10 or 11. I really think if it is DTR, that's going to be a very solid play in a week that, we feel like week 17 is kind of down, right? We have like the Eagles that we feel good about, maybe the Chargers. And then the rest of these teams feel like, I don't know, man, this is not a ton of great matchups, maybe not a ton of great defenses. Like we're still out here recommending the Colts, who we've kind of, trashed all year. But, I don't know. DTR is just a difference maker for fantasy defenses because of how objectively awful he has been throughout his entire playing career, including earlier this year. I mean, he has just been absolutely dreadful. In his first game as the starter, right, they went to him before they turned it over to Winston, and like, remember, I don't know if you guys remember, but Winston was actually the emergency third quarterback when Watson got hurt, right? So DTR came in. There was all this like controversy around it, and then DTR ended up getting hurt in that game, and Winston played pretty well. But when he came in after Watson, he was 11 for 24. He threw multiple picks, no scores, and it was just a nightmare. And then he played in relief of Winston in one of the games too, and he went 4 for 9 with a pick on 18 yards. Just absolutely dreadful. I cannot stress enough how bad he is and how much you want to play fantasy defenses against him. So Bengals for this week with somebody we haven't talked about, and then the Dolphins in week 17. If you can add them in the event that Dorian Thompson-Robinson is still going to start against them in week 17, they're definitely one of the hotter plays of the week.
Just one more DTR thing. I remember watching him, and I thought he was going to be the next hot shot at UCLA, and I gave him like a lot of hope. And then like every game I watched, I was like, okay, and that was in the Pac-12, so he's just awful.
Yeah,
this is the point I'm making.
Yeah, he's just objectively terrible. I mean, even if you look into last year's stats, I mean, he got some playing time last year, and it was awful last year too. Like, it was not like this is something where he showed some flashes last year. Then Winston kind of has been struggling with all these turnovers, and now we're going to give it to somebody who showed some flashes last year. He literally had less than 50% completion percentage. He had less than 4 yards per attempt. He had 1 touchdown pass against 4 interceptions and no rushing touchdowns. Like, completely and totally horrible. Like, he also was below, or, he's about 5 an attempt on the ground too. It's like, maybe we thought he's got some athleticism and some rushing ability, but that's not even there either. I cannot stress enough how he has showed objectively nothing at the pro level, in decent, in a couple of times getting on the field over 2 different years. So, I definitely think this has more to do with trying to figure out if they're going to keep him around next year, than, trying to win this year or trying to have fun with fireworks on offense this year. So yeah, that's where we're at with Miami, though. They're one of the better defenses that we could recommend here. And the flip side, though, is if DTR is so bad that he gets benched in this game and Winston comes back, you're not playing Miami against a Winston-led Browns team, right? So that's another thing where you got to check in on the situation next week after you have them, similar to the Commanders, right? Like, we're waiting on Penix, maybe we're waiting on DTR versus Winston for this one. So who they end up actually playing, or what the expectation actually is going into next week, is going to change with those 2 teams specifically. Going down to the next team is just a defense that's been pretty solid all year, and that's the Seattle Seahawks. So you're not playing them this week against Minnesota, one of the best offenses, but against Chicago, in a game that should be cold, could have some weather elements, and Chicago's offense over the last month has been pretty bad overall. So the Seahawks could be in a position where they're expected to perform pretty well. So their last 2 games were against Arizona and Green Bay. You're not starting defenses really against those 2 offenses, but they got 17 against the Jets the week before, and then 20 against Arizona the week before that. So, maybe there's something there. And they did score 7 against Arizona in week 14 again. Check in on them against Minnesota. I do expect them to have a pretty bad showing, but I could see against Chicago, if you're stuck going in against a team that's number 6 on the season overall, regardless of schedules and stuff. So I think they could be in a position to be decent for you if you're really stuck in a position.
Yeah, just keep an eye on how Caleb Williams plays against the Lions this week. Obviously, that's a tough matchup. Obviously, we think the Lions are a pretty decent start in week 16. So if he continues to regress or whatever you want to call it, like this could be a really good spot. If he has a bounce back, okay, maybe not so much. You go in a different direction, but just keep a close eye on that if you're thinking about Seattle.
Yeah. And going down to the last team that we're going to talk about here for week 17 is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And I really don't believe in them, but we have to bring them up because they've played the Giants and scored 12. They played Carolina and scored 3. They played the Raiders and scored 12, and they played the Chargers and scored 11 last week, including shutting the Chargers out in the second half. So, that's all after their bye week. Maybe they're generating some momentum. They get Dallas this week too. So, I mean, not maybe the worst play this week, and they get Carolina in week 17, which is what we really want to focus on. So, they've been playing better, but they already played Carolina and only scored 3 points against them. And they have probably the worst pass defense other than the Bengals in the league too. I mean, the quarterbacks that have played against them, I feel like have just been racking up points other than the last 2 weeks, kind of, right? I mean, and then the Giants are awful. So like, they held them to 7 points, but I just don't have any faith in the Buccaneers. They're 55% owned too. So they're getting played in a lot of leagues this week against Dallas. But if they're available, maybe check in on them as a possible 2-week play, or just, check in to see how Carolina looks, because Carolina had a month stretch where they looked pretty good, but then they took a big step back last week against Dallas. We were expecting kind of them to be better, and they were actually favored for the first time in like 2 years against Dallas, and then Dallas blew them out. So, anyways, Buccaneers, I guess, I don't know. I was kind of saying that about the Falcons and about the Raiders before, and the Falcons kind of stepped up and they had a monster game last week, and everybody's ranking them really high this week. So maybe that's the case here, right? They have a good game against the Chargers. Maybe then they have a monster game against Dallas, and you're going to want to have them on your team as an option for week 17 against Carolina.
Yeah, I mean, the Bucs to me are like a really weird defense, and this is a really weird situation going up against Carolina, because that might have been Bryce Young's best game he's played as a pro when he took him to overtime. And since then, he obviously didn't look very good against Dallas. So if he doesn't look good against the Cardinals, who have kind of a so-so defense, like, I think I'd be a little bit more confident in going with the Buccaneers here, just because they are a very aggressive team and they are rolling, like you mentioned, especially after the bye. But just, I'm kind of in a wait and see mood to see how Bryce plays this week.
All right, so moving on to a couple guys that I want to talk about outside of the defenses, right? We just went over our defensive recommendations for week 17. And obviously, we're at the very end of the year. So beat the waiver wire is kind of not exactly a thing, because we're looking at guys that could be helpful in week 17. But there are 2 players I wanted to highlight. The first being somebody we talked about last week in Kendre Miller. We did talk about it for obviously different reasons. Kamara was kind of under the weather coming into the game. We talked about following that situation. And then this week, he hurt his groin. Kamara did. So now it looks like Kendre is going to take over as the main back, but we also got news that this might be season ending for Kamara. So it's not just this week with Kendre Miller. It could be next week against the Raiders as well. He gets Green Bay this week and the Raiders next week. That could be a situation where he ends up being a monster against 2 deep run defenses that are just not that good. I don't know if he's going to play much in the passing game, but his counterpart, Jamal Williams, is not a pass catcher at all through like the last 4 years of his career. So if there is any sort of role like that for Miller, where he's going to get 3 or 4 targets, or he's going to get 15 carries, maybe, I think he could be really good in week 17. And if you win in week 16, he's on your bench and he does something like, 80 total yards and a score with 2 catches, that's going to be somebody that you're going to have to seriously consider playing against the Raiders. So I would get him onto the end of my bench. I do want to proceed with caution there. I don't want to hype him too much. I don't want to make it seem like we think he's like a must start or like a smash player, because he could very easily get hurt himself. He's played like 6 games in 2 years. So, I think it's a couple more than that, but he is not
Dennis Allen is gone, his arch nemesis. So
yeah. So anyways, I don't know. Kendre feels like somebody that could be in a good position. I lost Kamara. I mentioned that in the league. I'm considering him over Jerome Ford because of DTR and all the DTR hate that we just spewed. But I do think Miller is definitely somebody you want to try and get onto your team. I added him in our league together. The other guy I added that I think you should try and take a peek on if you have the roster space for him is Hollywood Brown. He's coming back this week. He's been practicing all week. So I do think there's a situation where he comes back, and I don't know if he's going to play in full. I don't know what his role is going to be against Juju and DeAndre Hopkins, but if he's out there for 60, 70% of the snaps, he plays in 3 wide receiver sets. Mahomes is going to play. So against Houston, we might see something. It's not like he hurt his knee. It's not like he's going to be needing to get kind of back into shape. It was a shoulder AC joint that he got surgery on. So, I do think that there is a chance he plays a full allotment of snaps. And if he does, maybe he's somebody that you can consider in week 17, or you could just keep away from your opponent in week 17. He gets Pittsburgh. I don't expect him to be a starter. But again, this is a beat the waiver wire guy that, I think could potentially show something this week that could make him a waiver priority next week.
Yeah. And unfortunately, all the Kendre Miller, Hollywood Brown best ball teams that I had did not make the playoffs, or else I'm sure there's some teams out there that might be in a good spot. But I think with Miller, like you mentioned, they want to see what they have with their young player. I think that's great that he's going to get the opportunity. And with Hollywood too, it's like we see this with Mahomes, where like the new guy comes in and then he gets heavily featured. We'll see. I think that there could be something there. So, and again, beat the wire, no risk pickups.
Yeah, and a bench, check in, see if you get something for week 17 once you start prepping for your title games. All right, and with that, good luck this week in your semifinal matchups. Really, really hope all of you guys listening to us make it to your championships, and we look forward to talking to you guys next week and getting you ready for that matchup. We'll be back with Start Sit next week. Obviously, there won't be any Beat the Waiver Wire coverage going into week 17, but maybe we talk about some defenses again before the week, try and get like a DST Start Sit out before Thursday night. And with that, thank you so much for watching. We look forward to talking to you in the next one.
Later.